The early summer wind carried red dust, slithering across the wasteland like a weary snake. Against the pale gray sky, a hawk circled slowly, its wingspan like blades sweeping the dry air. Below, the dirt road into southwestern New Mexico stretched on, with no end in sight, as if the world were nothing but dust, rocks, and the bare shadows of what had once been. A figure on horseback emerged from the horizon. He wore an old wool coat, frayed at the hem, and his shoulders sagged as if they had carried a dozen winters. The face beneath the wide-brimmed hat was dusty gray, hard as Highland stone. His eyes hollow, and without looking, he knew he had seen more blood than water. His name was Jonas Ward, and if you asked anyone in the borderlands, they would call him many things: the survivor, the old dog, the outdated buffalo, or simply the one who should have died. He never stopped for more than a night. He didn't ask questions. He didn't let anyone else ask questions. But this time, as his horse, an old stallion named Whiskey, turned into the canyon east of the Red Valley, he was forced to stop, for an arm was sticking out of the ash. At first, Jonas thought it was a body or robbery, another massacre. He jumped from the saddle, his hand resting loosely on the hilt of his gun, and walked slowly toward the pile of charred wood. The blackened beams lay across each other, and the smell of cold coal and old charred flesh lingered in the air. But then the arm moved. A low groan, not quite a human voice, but the sound of a spirit trying to find its way back. Jonas knelt down and pushed the wood away with his bare hands. The ash clung to his skin, burning, but he dug on. And then he saw a small, sooty face, eyes half open, half closed, a little girl. She didn't scream, didn't move, just looked at him. Jonas frowned. Alive. He picked her up. Her body was light as hay, but hot as a furnace. One arm was burned. Her lips were chapped. Her hair was charred. Around her neck, the wooden cross chain was broken in two, the cross still attached by coarse hemp. He set up camp under an ancient tamarind tree, covering her with his coat. The first night, she didn't say anything, didn't cry, didn't sleep. Jonas sat beside her, his pistol across his lap, his eyes wide open all night. He had seen children die in war, had picked them up only to find their bodies colder than desert sand. But this girl was alive and unlike any of them. Not because she was lucky, but because there was something in her eyes, something like a knife that had been stabbed and then sharpened. The next morning, Jonas put water to her lips. She drank. Little, but she drank. "What's your name?" he asked. Silence. "Do you understand what I mean?" She nodded, very slightly. "Where are your parents?" "Swesamisanya." She didn't answer. Jonas sighed. He had no experience with children, especially ones who had seen fire and blood. But he knew enough to know, if they looked adults in the eye, they weren't dead. That afternoon, they left. Jonas placed her on the horse, in front of the saddle. He didn't ask any more questions, didn't try to force her to talk. She sat still, her hands on the saddle, her head against his chest. Whiskey didn't complain. He seemed to understand that this time she was carrying something more than could be measured in flesh. They passed through cracked hills where the dry cactus bent in the wind, past an old settlement, where only the patched wall and the fallen chair remained. Jonas did not stop. He did not need anyone to see the child, because in these parts, a black man riding a horse with an Indian child was 100 reasons to be shot without trial. On the third day, as the sunset fell on the orange rocks, Jonas stopped by a small stream. He lit a fire. The girl, as always, sat beside him, saying nothing. But when he brought the bowl of stewed beans to her, she took it with both hands. It was the first time she had done anything proactive. Jonas nodded slightly, a small sign that a silent battle was being won. "You should eat," he said. She ate, slowly, but not half-heartedly. "Dashika reaches, do you have a name?" There was silence. "Then," she said, as softly as the wind through the grass, "Shilali." Jonas paused. It was Apache. He didn't know the exact meaning, but he knew enough. She hadn't forgotten her roots. Etsuwi. That night, the girl huddled in Jonas's old coat. Lying near the fire, the wind howled through the branches. And in the distance, Ishusarason, the wolves cried. Jonas didn't sleep. He sat watching the fire, turning over and over the broken cross she wore. "Shilali, Surshunernostinostenshin," he repeated. "You know the world doesn't need someone like you to survive, right?" She didn't answer. She just looked at him. He continued, hoarsely, "But they don't decide that." The next morning, When Jonas packed up camp, Shilali put the necklace back on. But this time, she tucked the cross inside her coat, not because she was afraid of losing it, but because it was the only thing she believed in, even though it was broken. As they mounted, Jonas looked far away to the southwest to a community the old soldier had told him about. A village without a sign, without a church, but with a law of its own, making a place where outcasts found a place. Ashwood, or at least that was the name the wind had carried to his ears. Jonas wasn't sure if it was true, but now he had no choice. For by the saddle sat a little girl named Chilali, and for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't alone. The next morning, the sun rose slowly through the mist that had lingered from the night's rain. Jonas sat on an old wooden chair, holding a cold cup of coffee, his eyes on the window where pale streaks of light swept across the dirt floor in front of the porch. In the back room, the girl's steady breathing still echoed softly, a fragile sound that indicated the presence of life. He hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Apache sentinel cornered against the cliff, blood spattered on the rocks, the horse screaming, and the child he had failed to save. When she woke, there was no crying, just those big eyes looking around, like a fawn awakening in a strange forest. She still didn't speak, but something in her gaze had changed. It wasn't outright fear anymore. It was a kind of wariness, as if she were trying to gauge whether Jonas was the one who was going to drag her back to where she had fled. He didn't say anything, just brought her the porridge. She ate this time, still slow, still cautious, but without resistance. Afterwards, Jonas quietly cleaned up, then went behind the stable to check the fence. Questions swirled in his mind. Where had she come from? Who had hurt her? And were they following the trail all the way here? When he returned, he found her sitting by the fire, a piece of charcoal in her hand, scribbling on the wooden floor, crude drawings, circles, dashes, and a reclining figure. The meaning was unclear, but to Jonas it was her first words. He knelt down and said softly, "What's your name?" "Just Minimon." There was no answer. But when he pointed to himself and repeated, "Jonas o number one," the girl bowed her head slightly. There was a pause. "Unmate tinanon der tun." Then, very softly, her voice came out for the first time like a breath of wind whistling through a rocky gorge. "Lita Akinium," he repeated, careful not to break the name with his deep voice. "Liter, okay." That afternoon, Jonas decided to take Whiskey out into the fields to check the tracks he had seen the day before. Lita limped out onto the porch, holding onto the door frame as if afraid the wind might carry her away too. Jonas turned and gestured softly. "Want to ride?" She didn't answer, but walked toward him, her eyes hesitant and curious. Whiskey was not an easy horse, but with Lita, he stood still, even bowed his head. Jonas chuckled, then lifted her into the saddle, while he held the reins. They circled the camp not far, just enough for Lita to feel the dirt beneath her hooves and the wind on her cheeks. Every time a gust of wind blew, she reached up and grabbed Jonas's neck. But she didn't scream. It was progress. When they returned, the sky was starting to turn yellow. Jonas saddled the horse, then sat down on the wooden steps to get the mud off his boots. Lita sat next to him, saying nothing. But for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't hide inside. He took a small piece of wood from his pocket and began to whittle to shape the horse. His hands worked quickly, evenly, the sound of the knife on the wood like a steady heartbeat. She watched, attentive. "His name is Whiskey," he said, not expecting a response. After a moment, she held out her hand, small and tanned. Jonas handed her the piece of wood. She took it, turned it over and over like a treasure, and held it to her chest. No words, but to Jonas, it was her way of saying thank you. Night fell quickly in the mountains. Jonas fed the wood into the stove, lit more oil lamps, and locked all the doors. He didn't forget to check his gun. It was still loaded. Not because of the wild animals, because of the people. Near midnight, as the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, he heard a noise. Very faint, a soft thud, as if something had fallen to the ground outside the stables. He took the gun and tiptoed to the door. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust to the pitch darkness outside. No one, no horse, but he saw a trace very faint, as if someone had been standing there, leaving a footprint that hadn't dried yet. When he returned, Lita was still awake. She sat in the corner, hugging the wooden horse, looking at him questioningly. Jonas shook his head and said softly, "It's okay. but he didn't believe it. The next morning, he went into town. He couldn't leave Lita alone. But he couldn't help it. He was out of medicine, almost out of salt. And above all, he had to get news. He left Lita in the camp store, blocking the door with a sack of corn. Before he left, he gave her a small brass whistle, something he'd kept in the army. Only blow it if it's dangerous, he instructed. Whiskey brought him to Piedra Blanca as the sun was high in the sky. The town wasn't big, a few shops, a church, a blacksmith shop, and a rundown bar. But here, people saw everything and they said everything. As Jonas entered the general store, the old clerk named Morales frowned. "I haven't seen you in a while," he said. "I hear the soldiers are hunting for some Apaches who escaped from the eastern camp. A girl, they say, went into the mountains." Jonas pretended not to care. "I need salt, oil, bandages." Morales packed the parcel, but his eyes did not leave Jonas. "Strange. Give me a one, Chirito," he said softly. "They say a black man helped the child. Has anyone seen the horse turn toward the ranch on the mountain?" Jonas tightened the strap of his hat. "That's a wasteland. No one lives there. Walond Hasumar Warna." Who knows?" Morales laughed. "That's just what people say. And rumors are stronger than dust on a saddle." Jonas paid and left. He didn't need to ask. The rumors had started, and once there was a fire, the vigilantes would find a way to add fuel. Lita was no longer safe. He returned to the camp faster than usual. When he got there, everything was quiet. The barn door was closed. The whistle hadn't blown. The girl was still there, sleeping beside the corn sack, the wooden horse in her arms. Jonas sat down beside her, his heart beating faster, not from the ride, but from the realization that he couldn't keep her here forever. And if he wanted to protect her, he had to get her away from here. Before the shadows really came, in the pale light of the last day, Jonas cleaned his rifle, refilled it, and quietly folded an old map and put it in his pocket. Arthur Surdadino, Bertsuri Widiwarnan, to the high ground, where the Apache communities had not yet been forced out. That was the only place where there was hope. On the table, he saw what she had left. A new drawing in charcoal. A mountain, Jorna Renenyawanchan. Samanta Urindas, a son, a horse, and two people. One big, one small, walking side by side. Rumors, in border towns like Piedra Blanca, spread faster than the plague. They needed no legs, no wings, just a peek through a window, an ill-timed glance, or the sound of spurs in the middle of a night when it should have been quiet. The next morning, as Jonas was chopping wood behind the camp, Lita sat on the wooden steps, her legs dangling, her arms wrapped around the little wooden horse he had made. She still didn't say much, but something in her eyes had softened, like a scar beginning to close. Jonas noticed. She often looked north. Every time he said, "Leave her horse," she turned her eyes there, where the pale mountains hugged the horizon. It seemed that she instinctively knew this was not a place to stay for long. That afternoon, someone came. He heard the sound of hooves in the distance, unhurried but heavy, the kind of people familiar with the soil and rocks of this area. Jonas hid Lita in the old cellar behind the camp, under the floorboards camouflaged with sacks and ash. She was used to this hiding, and this time, without much warning, she just nodded and crawled down. When he came out onto the porch, Tom Halvers, the chief of police of Piedra Blanca, had dismounted, touching the brim of his hat, his eyes scanning the front yard as if searching for dried blood or some other poorly concealed trace. "Jonas," Halvers said, his voice like sandpaper. "Long time no see in town." Jonas nodded slightly. "The camp needs tending, and I have no need for cards or a drink. Someone saw hoof prints going up the mountain. Someone else said they saw a small shadow behind you a few days ago." Jonas tightened the strap of his hat. "I keep horses, and I live alone." Halvers nodded, as if he were listening to a familiar story, but still wanted to hear the end. To find a loophole, there was an escape from Fort Easley. He said, "A group of Apache kids. One was wounded," the guards said. "They thought he was dead, but they've seen old fire marks near the North Cliffs lately." Jonas did not answer. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "You know the situation. Thorn, or Mwachemekati." Halvers said, lowering his voice, "The race thing in this part of the country is as thin as wet paper. One false report could set the whole valley ablaze. Is there anyone here with you? It's just the wind and the horses?" Jonas answered. Halvers sighed. "I'm not here to arrest you. Just so you know, If there's anyone here, especially a native child, it's not going to be easy. The soldiers from Fort Easley are closing in. They have the right to search the house. Jonas, så kommer det där. The order's been given. To never in morning. Jonas nodded, still clutching the pistol in his coat pocket. Halvor sat for a few minutes, talking idly about this year's corn crop, then left. But when his back disappeared behind the cactus, Jonas knew the cutoff was near. That night, Lita painted again. Not the floor this time on old parchment Jonas had pulled from a wooden chest. She had drawn 3 figures, a curly-haired adult, a little girl, and another dressed in green, holding a whip. The third's face was twisted and streaked. Jonas knew instantly. It was a guard at Fort Easley. You ran from them, he asked. Lita nodded. Who else ran with you? She bent her head, drawing a diagonal line through the other small figure, someone who hadn't survived. Jonas squeezed the edge of the table. Outside, a light rain was falling. The wind whistled through the cracks in the roof, blowing in like the cold breath of things untold. We'll go tomorrow. I said, sir. He did, sir, he said. Lita looked up, her eyes not surprised, just silent agreement. The next morning, Jonas woke in the dark. He packed his things, rations, ammunition, an old map that was water-stained and torn at the edges. He wrapped Lita's small blanket, then checked the saddle, the bridles, and blocked out any signs of their time at camp. Before he left, he took the wooden horse and left it on the mantelpiece. Part of him knew he might never come back. But like the past, some things should be kept to remind him that he had chosen right. Whiskey drove them through the northern trails, through the familiar underbrush and rocky crevices. Jonas didn't say much, neither did Lita. They just walked to Defri the Rimamon, 2 shadows in a sleeping land. As the sun rose, a great cloud of dust rose in the distance. Jonas stopped his horse and took out his binoculars. A column of horsemen, 6 of them in blue uniforms, rode straight toward his camp. Here we are, he said softly. Lita watched, expressionless, but her hands tightened on the reins. She didn't need to say it, but Jonas knew. She remembered, and she was afraid. They edged into the ravine. The road was steep and treacherous, but Jonas had been a soldier, had led patrols through more dangerous routes. Lita rode steadily, it seemed, though she had never been taught, that she knew how to sit still, to keep her balance, as if horses were part of her Apache blood. After noon, they stopped by a small stream. Jonas checked his map, pointed it out to Lita. We have 3 days' journey, if it goes well, but avoid all the main roads. She didn't ask why, and there was no need. That evening, they lit a small fire, a cooking fire. No guiding fire. Jonas told her about his mother, who had lived in Georgia, and who had taught him to close his eyes and listen to the wind and to sense directions by the smell of the trees. Lita said nothing, but she listened and sat close by, eyes on the fire but ears attentive to every beat. When they slept, Jonas kept the gun under his arm. The girl slept beside him, but not curled up anymore. She lay flat, like someone who no longer needed to hide from her shadow. The next morning they set off again, out back, where the lumber camp had stood. The soldiers would have dug the house up by now, but they found nothing but the little wooden horse lying quietly on the hearth in a spot on the floor where the dust had not yet settled. They left Ashwood when the sky was still gray. Jonas left no note, only a pack of cigarettes and a bullet on the dining room doorstep, the old signs of those who had lived on the run. Thank you. I owe you. I'll be back when I can. Chilali did not ask why they were going. She had not asked since the night the doll had been shot to pieces in the grassy hills. Whiskey rode steadily, the sound of his hooves mixed with the wind. Jonas let Chilali sit in front, his arm wrapped loosely around her to keep her from falling over the potholes. In the saddlebags were dried beans, bread, and a second gun he had not used for a long time. The land to the west stretched wild and silent, as if the wind itself had stopped breathing when it passed over the rocky hills. Fine dust covered his hat, his shoulders, and his nameless memories. Jonas did not yet know where they were going, but he knew. He had to get Chilali out of harm's way before the ghost in uniform returned. On the 3rd day, they crossed an old mountain road. Jonas remembered this place. In 1875, he had ridden along this route himself, under orders to clear the remaining native settlements. He was not yet 30. His back was still straight, his eyes were still bright, and his faith was still something that could be measured by the badge on his chest. Now, the same place, the same wind, but no longer the faith. Jonas stopped his horse by a small stream, set up camp under the shade of a tree. Shillelagh dismounted, without speaking, and silently lit a fire with a flint as he had taught her. The girl now knew how to pour water, how to keep the wind from blowing the fire. Survival skills that no one taught her in books. As the sunlight slanted over the water, a voice spoke from the other side of the trees. Are you still alive? Jonas drew his gun reflexively, but then realized Lita. Lita had been an army nurse, half Mexican, half Apache. Her voice was hoarse from cigarettes. Her back was bent from having saved the lives of more than a dozen young soldiers under bombs. The last time Jonas saw her, he was wounded in the leg. She had stitched up the wound without asking why he had deserted his unit. She approached, empty-handed, carrying only a cloth bag and a look that was both mocking and apologetic. Rumor has it you rescued a girl from the ashes. The rumor is true this time, Jonas said, then turned to Shillelagh. She stood up, looking at Lita, not afraid, not shying away, just waiting. Lita paused, then nodded. Does she have a name? Jonas started to answer, but Shillelagh spoke first. Shillelagh. Lita was stunned. Do you know what it means? Jonas shook his head. Ipachi Yishardinchurn. It means snow in the wind. Sir, a beautiful name, but rarely used. Only for a girl born on a cold night. In the middle of the killing season, her mother may have been a ceremonial keeper. They had dinner together, beans, crackers, and some wild berries that Lita had picked from the mountainside. The fire was small. The wind was light. Lita told old stories of marches, of bodies floating in streams, of babies left behind because no one knew what to do with them. Shillelagh said nothing. Just listen. After the meal, Jonas took a small piece of paper from his pocket, torn in half, and handed it to Lita. On it were some smudged black ink and a strange drawing, a circle with an arrow through it, next to the crossed-out coal sign that Shillelagh had kept since the first campfire. This was around her neck when I found it, he said. Lita frowned. A messenger's sign. What messenger? Not sure, but usually the ones chosen to carry the last message between divided communities. It's an old story. No one uses it anymore. Jonas looked at Shillelagh. Were your parents messengers? She was silent. Then she pulled a small, charred piece of wood from her lap, the other half of a cross. She placed it next to the paper. Lita sighed. Ward, I don't know what you're getting her into, but if you go any further, be careful. Someone is hunting those who knew the old language. The old signs. The government doesn't want the Apaches to remember they had their own communication system, their own laws, their own lands. We're talking about the past. Yes, but people die from the past. Every day, Jonas did not sleep that night. He put his gun down and sat watching the fire. His mind was filled with images of the caravans being marched south, the bodies of children floating across the river, and the first time he disobeyed orders to save an old Indian woman holding her grandchild. Shillelagh lay nearby, her eyes closed, but her hands clutched the piece of wood and the piece of paper as if they were the last thread connecting her to the nameless people. The next morning, before they left, Lita handed Jonas a small leather bag. Here's a map to the hollow. She said, a place deep in the valley where the messengers used to gather. If there were any survivors of the girl, they'd be there. What? Does anyone know this place besides you? Only those who had names no one called. Jonas nodded. Shillelagh's eyes met Lita's one last glance. Then she turned away. They continued on their journey south, toward the secrets that waited to be named. And now, Shillelagh was no longer an unknown child. She had a name, a clue, and a thin thread connecting her to a history that had been deliberately buried. They left Lita's mountains in the early morning, when the sun was still behind the thick clouds of the dry season. The wind carried dust and the smell of burnt trees, and it swept across the mountainside like the whispers of those who had lived and died here. Jonas said little, just shoved the leather bag Lita had given him deep into his saddle. The hand-drawn map to the hollow was blurry, marked by natural markings, a dead pine tree, a finger-shaped rock, a wall red as clotted blood. But it was enough for Jonas, enough to believe they were on the right track, or at least somewhere to go. Whiskey kept his step. Shillelagh sat in the saddle, her arms around the reins as usual, her hair disheveled by the wind. The piece of paper and half a cross were now tucked into her breast pocket, unmentioned. But Jonas knew. They were becoming the backbone of this little girl. On the second day, they crossed the abandoned land, where an old army encampment had once stood. Now only the foundations of the walls and scattered bones. Jonas stopped his horse at noon, huddled under a rocky arch. He lit a fire. The wind blew through the ravine, howling like the wailing of the dead. Chilali washed her face with water from a gourd, then silently arranged the bowls, dividing the dried beans. For the first time, or Morina de Shurikamrani, Jonas noticed. She was in control. No need to be told. No need to wait for a signal. Clean gestures. Observant eyes. Straight back. Children don't do that. Survivors do. As they ate, Jonas opened the map again. He showed it to Chilali, pointing to a small dot in the middle of the mountains, circled in old charcoal. The hollow and Tunfonanawanan, Shaboom. If it's true, there's someone here who was my parents' ally. And if it's false, Gistamerfanamern, she asked, her voice low but clear. Then we'll keep going. Shilali nodded, saying nothing. But for the first time, Jonas saw in her eyes not just sadness, but companionship. That afternoon, as they crossed a barren canyon, something was strange. Whiskey slowed down. His ears pricked up. His nose sniffed. Jonas tightened the reins, his eyes scanning the cliffs. Then a small click. Jonas pushed Chilali to the ground, rolling behind the horse. A bullet lodged in the trunk of a tree a few feet away. Ambush, he hissed, drawing his gun, retreating behind the ledge. Erme. From above, 3 figures appeared, wearing black scarves over their faces, guns in their hands. Hand her over. A voice called out. Horse. Quartet the ones. With a heavy Eastern accent, not from around here. Jonas did not answer. He looked at Chilali. She was trembling, but her eyes did not flinch. Can you run? He asked quickly. She nodded, without hesitation. Go through the crevice on the left. Run toward the dead oak. There's a hole. Hide in there. And you, when do you know him? Jonas smiled wryly. You're the decoy. The gunfight was quick. Jonas fired 2 shots to the right, then rolled to the left. One screamed, hit in the shoulder. The other 2 returned fire, the bullets churning up dust. Jonas moved on, Svorkanin, forcing them to split up. Meanwhile, Chilali was slipping through the crevice, but one and the third saw her passing. He dove. Chilali ran. Her heart was pounding. The wind whipped her face, but she didn't scream, didn't turn. Then she stumbled. The other man closed in, but as he reached out to grab her, Chilali spun around, pulled a sharp-edged piece of wood from her pocket, and stabbed him in the thigh. He screamed and fell. She kicked him in the stomach with all her might, then ran on, ducking into the oak crevice. It was dusk when Jonas reached her. All 3 were wounded. 2 ran away. One was left with a bullet wound in his leg. Jonas didn't ask any questions. He just reached out and pulled Chilali out of the crevice. She held him tight. For the first time, not out of fear, but because she had just conquered herself, they spent the night in a shallow cave. Jonas bandaged the cut on Chilali's hand. Small, but deep. You know where to stab him. Ona first im. He asked. Father taught me, but never. To use it, Sir Flarkin. Jonas nodded, said no more. Chilali whispered. I don't want to die, but even less to be captured alive. After a moment of silence, Jonas replied, then from now on, we will fight as survivors, not as fugitives. Before falling asleep, Chilali took the piece of paper out of his pocket. Turning it over, Jonas noticed for the first time a short string of symbols, like a code. I think, this is another location, maybe the next road, maybe a warning, or the recipient's name. Jonas nodded. He remembered the old wartime letters when a messenger was only allowed to know the final destination if the recipient was still alive. And if not, it was like wind blowing through a hollow, no answer. They left Ashwood before dawn. The air between the mountains and the valleys was still misty and silent, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Wetwood dating. Jonas tied the saddlebag, glanced at Chilali, who sat silently on the old log, her eyes distant, as if looking at something long lost. Whiskey cleared his throat as Jonas mounted. Chilali said nothing, but when he raised his hand, she climbed into the saddle behind him, a new habit, but as natural as if it had always been there. They headed northwest, a place Jonas had heard Lita mention in their conversation last night. A place called the Hollow, the Hidden Place. Lita said little. leaving behind a piece of paper with a simple carving, 3 diagonal lines across a circle and a note. Find this symbol, if it's right. They'll know. The next 3 days were quiet. Rugged mountains, dense forests, and dry streams greeted them with all the harshness of the West. Chilali became more proactive, building her own fires, filtering her water, and occasionally pointing out familiar plants Jonas had never heard of. Though she said little, her eyes lit up, not with hope, but because something inside her was being released. On the 4th day, they came to a narrow valley, steeply walled and overgrown with trees that seemed to hide something. Jonas looked around and saw it, a symbol on a stone jutting out from the moss. 3 diagonal lines, a circle in the middle, like a long-awaited sign. "We're here," he said softly. Chilali looked at the stone, but made no move. Jonas led his horse closer, parting the vines and rubble, revealing a crack in the rock big enough for a man to crawl through. There was no gate. Ishchawam tamenmenententer. No guard, only silence. Inside, they passed through a narrow stone corridor that led into the heart of the mountain. The dim light from outside was not enough to illuminate the area, but the wind inside carried a steady echo, like a distant whisper. Jonas instinctively reached for his gun, while Chilali touched the necklace hidden in his collar. After 100 paces, they entered a large cave, where light was dimly emitted from a crack in the ceiling high above. A group of people stood there, 4 or 5, in rough clothes, searching eyes. One stepped forward, tall, thin, Terneshcharitz, with ashen hair. "Who are you?" "I was a frontiersman. I knew a girl named Lita. She sent me here." The man looked at Chilali. "Who is she?" "A survivor." No one laughed. "No one invited me in." Finally, an older woman from the group stepped forward. She wore a gray cloak and held a wooden stick with a pebble at the end. "A symbol?" she asked. "Do you have any proof?" Jonas produced a piece of paper. She took it, holding it to the light. "This mark cannot be forged, but it is not enough. I am not looking for shelter. I am looking for answers." The woman looked at Chilali, then nodded. "Come in." "But only you." Jonas hesitated, but Chilali nodded. He handed her the spare pistol, then followed the old woman deeper inside. The small room in the mountain was strangely warm. The walls were carved with hand-drawn symbols, images of horsemen, Apache and Navajo signs, and strange characters Jonas had never seen before. The old woman pointed. "Do you know why Lita chose you?" "Num, she. Because you were silent when you had to choose between what was right and what was easy?" Jonas did not answer. She is part of the network of messengers, but she does not know. Her mother was a messenger, died in the fire at Las Palmas." Jonas exhaled, as if the burden that had been in his chest for so long had a name. "And now, the people who burned the village, who hunted the survivors, know she is alive. They will come. I did not abandon her. Nobody told you to abandon them. But when you leave here, you have a choice, to be a keeper or to be a decoy." Jonas stood up. "I choose the third. To be a mover, not to stop long enough to be caught." The woman nodded. She pulled something out of her shirt, a broken cross. "The other piece. It needs this. Both pieces will open the door they're looking for. Go toward the bell. When you hear it, don't hesitate." Jonas took it. Left the room. Chilali was waiting. He said nothing, just handed her the piece of wood. She looked at him. Her eyes lit up, as if she had received a piece of memory. They left the hidden place just as the sun was setting. There were no farewells. There was only the sound of the wind, and in the distance, the faint sound of a metal bell ringing through the valley, like a wake-up call. Jonas turned to Chilali. "Ready when a run?" She nodded, and they left, toward the place where the bells called the names of those who had no way back. Friday began with thick fog and an unnamed road. Jonas and Chilali followed an old path that wound around the mountainside, where rocks and grasses fought for every inch of dry ground. The wind blew from the north, carrying a strange smell, not smoke, not carcasses, but the smell of damp ash, something that had been in Jonas's nose from battles he no longer wanted to remember. From afar, a bell rang, not loud, unknown, but steady, like someone tapping rusted metal with the rhythm of someone no longer in a hurry. "Hear that?" Jonas asked. Chilali nodded slightly behind him. She put her hand on Jonas's back, not squeezing, just touching, as if sending a silent signal that she felt something. something important. And they followed the bell. It took nearly 2 hours to circle the rocky slopes, avoid some deep ravines, and pass through a clump of dry cactus. And finally we saw it. A small chapel made of crumbling white stone, precariously located between two mountains. Beside it was a leaning cross, one arm broken, as if the faith here had also been broken in two by the mountain wind and people. In front of the chapel sat a man, a thin man in a dark brown monk's robe, holding a small bell that he kept ringing steadily. As they approached Arnimano on Monum, he looked up, his eyes dull but strangely bright. Stranger, Siriluan, Surapidiwadi turned to Swanasa. He said in a mixture of Spanish and English. Your horse is tired. Jonas nodded. We're just taking a break. We're not looking for trouble. He shook his head. People who come here don't look for trouble. Trouble finds them. Jonas dismounted, helping Chilali. They sat down to rest on the stone steps. The girl watched the man. Her eyes were not wary as they were of strangers, but rather more probing. Jonas sensed something. Tui in them. Not the sacred, but he had seen too much to be surprised. You're the priest here, Jonas asked. Before, he said, smiling slightly. Now I'm just the keeper of a place where no one prays. He looked at Chilali. She's an Apache. Wayidibasirkus, Surashawan. Jonas paused. Her name is Chilali, and she's looking for a place to live. Not here, he said, looking up at the broken cross. I once hid a mother and 2 children. They were taken away. I couldn't do anything. He looked at Jonas again, this time with a look as sharp as a rusty blade. You have a gun, but are you braver than I am? Jonas didn't answer right away. He looked up at the cross, which had been tilted to one side by the wind. I don't believe in God. He said. The priest smiled. That's okay. God still believes in you. Chilali stood up and walked toward the cross. She touched the broken part. Her small fingers ran lightly over the scratched wood, as if trying to feel the pain of something that had been built to protect someone. She said nothing, but when she turned back, her eyes were 9 years older than 10. There is a path through the woods to the west. The pastor said, It Hanimanawan. It is not marked on the map. It leads to the rock crevice where the tribesmen live, where there are no American laws. Na serminum, no insignia, no soldiers, only those who have escaped, who have lived, one hasawino, mihwayina. And Jonas asked, and the soldiers know that way? Kuwar to sheshurum. The wind blew. The cross creaked like weeping wood. Clouds rolled in from the summit, casting shadows over part of the cliff. I have only 2 days' journey, but no path is clear, no path that does not require me to lose something. Jonas turned to Chilali. Are you ready? She nodded, without hesitation. He knew the answer lay not in the words, but in the eyes that had seen their mother turn to ash, but had chosen to go forward. Unbowed, as they were about to leave, the pastor called back. He took off the small wooden cross he wore around his neck, a broken arm, too, and gave it to Chilali, not to pray for, he said, just to remember that what is broken can stand again, if someone lifts it up. The girl took it, not fully understanding, but she put it in her pocket, touching her heart. Jonas nodded to him. Thank you. Chumancho. Father, Nazoshpinim. Don't thank me. The priest replied. Live so that no one has to erect a statue of you because you're dead. When they left the chapel, the bells had stopped. The wind was blowing again, and the cross, though broken, for Lefernon, was still standing swaying but not falling. It had been raining since the afternoon. Not a violent storm, but a sad, lingering rain cold, soaking into clothes, into the ground, into the bones. Jonas and Chilali left the western forest path as the priest had directed, following the path along a rocky crevice with thick underbrush and slippery, soft soil. The path was unpaved, covered with dry branches and mossy rocks, but no one could keep up without knowing how to walk. Whiskey was Sherwin, the faithful horse. A Wensuwaranastukanasidrum breathed heavily as he crossed the shallow, rocky stream. Jonas paused for a moment to check the hoof prints. There were no fresh ones. He exhaled, but the wind changed, carrying a different smell. Iron, hubikern, burnt, and gunpowder, swarnawarn, are from the south, he said, looking at Chilali. They're circling. She didn't speak, but her eyes showed understanding. The silence between them was no longer distance, but language. Jonas drew a curve in the ground with his hand. If we go forward, We'll cut through the exposed top. Exposed, he pointed to the left curve. If we go along the rocks, we might be able to escape, but only if they're not already surrounded. Shillelagh took the broken cross from her pocket and clasped it tightly in her hand. Not to pray, just to remember why she was still walking. They chose to go up the ravine, leaving the path, cutting into the forest. By midnight, the rain had stopped. The air was damp and dense. Every step echoed with the sound of water, the trees rubbing against each other like whispering spirits. Jonas stopped when he saw a small fire in the distance. It was unclear, but it was golden. It could be a barracks, or a trap, or both. He signaled to stop, creeping forward like an old panther. Jonas crawled up a rise. Below him stood a group of 5 men, cavalrymen, standing guard. In one of his hands was a piece of paper, a sketch of his face. The ink was smudged, but it was recognizable. Jonas tightened his grip on his gun. Below, Watsibwan, the sergeant was speaking. We'll hold here. Williams and the second squad are behind. He'll come in sooner or later. Jonas crawled back. They're blocking it, he whispered. We've got to create a diversion. He unzipped his pouch. He took out 2 homemade smoke pellets made of gunpowder and dry dust, something he had carried since his old soldier days. He handed Shillelagh his small gun. You know how to shoot? He asked. She nodded. He lifted them up and released the safety as he had learned over the past few days. Run straight for the western cactus. When you hear 2 shots, don't stop. Understand? She squeezed his hand. And you? I'll be there later. Shillelagh hesitated, but then nodded. Then she hugged him. Not like a child hugging a father, but like a living man who knew that after tonight, things might not be the same. Jonas slid down, pulled the pins off the 2 smoke pellets, and threw them in 2 different directions. Boom. Burmum. Burmum. White smoke rose, followed by screams and chaos. Shillelagh ran, like an arrow tearing through the night. Jonas charged in the opposite direction. He fired 2 shots into the air, causing the soldiers to change direction. One recognized him. That's him. Vermeerinanas Sharon with Canadian. 3 guns pointed up. Jonas rolled to the right, fired backward, and hit the first man in the shoulder. He screamed, fell. Another shot grazed Jonas's arm. Blood spurted, but he didn't stop. There was no time to grieve. He threw the last smoke grenade, then circled up the ridge, where the shortcut led west. His breathing was labored, but he remembered he had to live. Not for himself, for the girl. After a mad run, he stopped at a high point. Below, a small figure crawled across the sand. It was Shillelagh. Safe. He smiled. In pain. In fatigue. He smiled. Keep going. Snowbird. He whispered. I'm still here. The sound of hooves behind him grew more distant. The wind carried the scent of blood. But ahead, the border appeared. The sun rose from the east like a new promise. The land before them was vast, wild, rugged, uncharted. But there were tents, smoke from stoves, figures moving in the dust and early wind. No one wore badges. No one bowed. Jonas stood on the last slope, his shirt torn, dried blood on his arms, his gun hanging loosely at his back. Next to him, Shillelagh, small feet covered in red dust, hair tangled, but eyes brighter than ever before. They had arrived. The village was at the junction of 3 small valleys, built together by men who had escaped from the barracks, from the white law, from hunger, from war. No signs, no flags, but every stone, every cloth, every log had someone behind it who had paid the price to still be able to call themselves free. A man came out to meet them. About 41. One nostenturant, brown, one, black-eyed, carrying a pistol but not drawing it. Stranger from the blood, he said in a mixture of English and Navajo. Your name? Jonas Ward. Jonas said, tired but clear. Former Buffalo soldier. No orders. Just someone to live. He looked at Shillelagh. His eyes softened. Her name? Shillelagh. Greatsher. The man nodded. Then he turned to the man behind him. Open the door. 2 of you? No one is after you. They were led through a low wooden fence. Inside, the sounds were different. Children's voices. Pots and pans boiling. A distant banjo. It was not paradise, but it was a place where no one asked for papers. No one asked for blood. No one asked to leave. An old woman handed Jonas a cup of warm water. Shillelagh was led to a small hut where two other girls were waiting with sweaters and toast. Jonas looked around. A black child riding a wooden horse. An old man weaving baskets beside a pile of firewood. A pregnant young woman carrying water. Everyone had scars, real scars or scars of the heart, but no one hid them. Scars were the reason for their existence here. Jonas entered the low wooden house, the designated resting place. There was a mirror in the house. For the first time in days, he looked at himself. No longer a soldier, no longer a fugitive, just a man who had kept a promise to a little soul and brought her to a place where life was the only thing that was sacred. As the afternoon wore on, a brief meeting took place in the small square where a flat stone served as a platform. An old Indian woman stood up. Who brought this child? Jonas stepped forward. Me? Are you going to stay? She asked. Jonas looked at Shillelagh now playing with the other children with flat stones. Not afraid, not cowering, really smiling. No, he said. I was just passing through. I brought her to Mayuradi Sundimari. She belongs here now. She nodded. You can stay the night. Tomorrow, if you go, you'll be shown the way. That night, they lit a fire together. There was storytelling in 3 languages. There was a song without words, sung in the hoarse voice of a survivor. Jonas did not sing, but he sat there, next to Shillelagh, eating roasted corn, listening to her peaceful breathing. Before going to bed, she turned to him. Are you going? Jonas nodded. I'm here. I don't want you to go. He paused. He bent down and said softly, neither do I, but I belong to the long road. And you, I need roots. She nodded, her eyes sad but understanding. She pulled the broken cross from her pocket and placed it in his hand. I'll give it back, she said. It helped me get here. Now it's time to help you. Jonas held tight. Nothing. They held each other. An embrace without blood, without hatred, only warmth. The next morning, Jonas rode whiskey out of the village. No one saw him off. But when he reached the top of the last hill, he turned back and there stood Shillelagh. Small as a speck of dust in the dawn, she waved. He didn't wave back, but he put his hand to his chest where the cross lay, broken but intact. And he went on, carrying his story of an Apache girl, of a mother who burned in silence, of a pastor without God, and of a soldier who chose right over orders. 2 years had passed since Jonas left Ashwood. It was a pale morning, when winter had faded like the last breath of an old memory. He left without warning, leaving only a promise in his eyes, the kind of promise that adults rarely keep. But children always believe. Shillelagh had stood there, on the porch of the little inn on the south side of the hill, watching the horse's shadow recede until the rolling sands had hidden all traces. And from that day on, no one spoke the name Jonas Ward again. No need. No one really needed to say it, because Ashwood was still alive. And in every crack of the town were his footprints. Ashwood was no longer a hidden place. It had a name. There was a landowner, a hand-painted wooden sign across the dirt road. Ashwood Ilnarsharuwarm, the land of the free. Small houses were built, more evenly, more steadily. Comanches, Wakapinan and Western, Apaches Wanarum, Niabarshitsid, Kishwewan. Black ex-slaves, Mexican outcasts, everyone had contributed. Shillelagh was 14 now. Her hair was waist-length, braided in vegetable-dyed cloth. She learned to read and write, to add and subtract, and most important, to tell what she saw. Every Saturday night, around the campfire, she told stories to the children about night wolves, men with double shadows, and a man who once hid a gun under an old coat, but never killed an innocent person. His name is Jonas. She would finish, and he hasn't disappeared. He's just waiting for the right moment to come back. The villagers laughed. No one nodded or disagreed, but everyone remembered the words. On Friday morning, the wind shifted from the west, carrying the smell of old gunpowder and a faint metallic smell. Shillelagh was hanging her cloak behind the kitchen when she heard the sound of horses. Not one, Enum, but many even and strong, like a military formation. She rushed out into the front hall. At the top of the hill, 12 figures emerged. They were mounted on horseback, wearing blue-gray cloaks, rifles slung across their backs. One of them raised his hand. We're from Fort Laramie. We have people living illegally on government land. No one answered. Old Nantan, the village legend, leaned on his cane to greet them. The wind whipped his silver hair, but his back was straight. This land is our ancestral land. No one is allowed to expel anyone. A young officer sneered. No one is allowed. Do you have papers? Shalali stepped forward and pulled a frayed roll of parchment from her cloth bag. This is a copy of the Freeland Decree of 1865, sealed by the Board of Reconciliation in Santa Fe, signed by the Arizona Bar. The officer did not take it. An unofficial document is worthless. You are taking national land. A murmur ran through the villagers. Shalali said, then we will not go. Not because we are not afraid, but because once again you want to bury a village with guns and papers. That is rebellion. No, she replied. That is resistance. That night, drums beat from the mountaintop. Shalali wore Jonas's coat too big, but warm enough. She did not make a long speech, but said one and ferido and norn and oriented. They will come tomorrow morning. Whoever wants to leave, go. But if you want this land to continue to bear the name Ashwood, don't let the fire go out. She pointed to the broken cross hanging in front of the big tent. This once guided one man. Now it will guide us all. As the sun rose, the army entered the valley. But Ashwood did not flee. Women, children, old men all lined up, unarmed, carrying only their registration cards, their catechisms, and incense. Only Chilali, holding a wooden stick, stood in the middle of the road, blocking the path of the soldiers. There will be a trial, the officer announced. Hono de Sharbawan Kimir. Anyone who does not withdraw will be considered obstructing the execution of the law. Then let me begin. He gave a signal. A soldier raised his gun. The shot never rang out. For from behind, a galloping horse sounded strong and sharp as a summons. From a distance, a figure on a black horse charged. The wind whipped up his woolen cloak. His face was covered in dust. His eyes were sunken. Jonas, he said nothing. He just rode straight up to Chilali, stopped, and looked up at the officer. Edinorn, this girl is mine. She bears my name, and I am a legal citizen, a recipient of military decorations. She is my adopted daughter. Under the Freedom Protection Act of 1870, the officer frowned. Jonas pulled a small leather bag from his inner shirt papers. A broken cross, a bronze medal, a Tarza Remanero. If you want to verify, go back to the fort. But here, you have no authority. Silence. Only the snorting of the horse. Finally, the officer said, it's not worth fighting. Let's retreat. As the dust settled, as the horse's hooves receded, the Ashwood stood still for a long time. Chilali turned to Jonas. Why did you come back? He breathed to where Yowanether weren't sons, his eyes dry. Because you're tired of running away from things worth keeping. He said no more. There was no need. Chilali stood in the middle of the square, where the villagers were rekindling their fires. She spoke, louder than she had ever told the story before. People come and go, but if the ones who stay don't speak for them, there's only ashes. What should we do? A child asked. She bent down and touched his forehead. Write it down, and live well enough that others will listen. Ashwood, the unmarked land, was still off the map, but in a worn-out notebook tucked away in a corner of the tent, a line was written in both English and Apache. Here's where a little girl who wouldn't die taught others how to live. Years later, the old men of the western lands still told of a small village with no sign, no church, no flag but a law written by hand, hanging in the common tent. In a handwritten scrawl that was both scrawl and decisive. And two names, a man whose origins are unknown, who has survived many wars but never won any, except one, the fight to save a little girl who had no papers. No name, no reason to live, except life itself. The other is the little girl, raised in the ashes, writing with her hand a story that should have been buried. No one knows where they went, or if they are still alive. Some say the girl led the caravan to the western border, opening up another community. Others say the old black man was buried at the base of a broken cross. But there was no grave, only stones arranged in the shape of an arrow. And some children, sometimes, running on the hillside, would pick up a piece of old leather strap or a frayed piece of paper with the words written in purple ink. If anyone remembers, it is not lost. People no longer call Jonas Ward or Chilali. They just say, the keeper of the fire, the child knows how to live.